Blak, they all died in custody.
The death of a young local sparked impassioned.
They can't believe that no one will be charged.
In fact, incarceration is the disadvantaged and unequal position of Aboriginal people.
I'm going to see justice before I die.
They should be accountable for her death.
How many more before we go enough is enough?
Warning. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are advised that this video may contain images, voices and videos of deceased persons. There may also be words and descriptions that may be culturally sensitive and no longer used.
We have an Aboriginal man here whose spirit is not at rest.
In January 2008, in the peak of summer, on one of Western Australia's hottest days, an Aboriginal elder was slowly dying in the back of a van, transporting him across Australia's harsh outback. The name of this man and his story would go on to horrify West Australians for the ages.
The man, poor man, was cooked alive.
I felt sick. And I felt if it had been a white person, this would not have happened. And that was even more sickening to think of that.
The human life that was taken from us is important. He was an elder.
Mr Ward died from heat stroke just minutes after arriving in Kalgoorlie.
The Aboriginal elder had been arrested for drink driving in Laverton and was being driven to prison in Kalgoorlie.
Mr Ward died after a 4-hour trip in the back of a sealed prison van with no air conditioning in 40+ degree heat.
He was put in the van and given just 1.5 litres of water.
Well, he suffered burns on the floor of the van. It was so hot.
The suffering he must have sustained, so awful, so shameful.
Mr Ward was the chairman of the Warburton community and key advisor.
And we are the decision makers who are working with the government.
He was a good man. He was a good uncle.
Just the most inhumane, cruel, racist killing of innocent Aboriginal people. Just pain. I remember people crying outside rallies and, you know, it's just not stopping. And this state is not changing.
Horrified to think that a senior person, an Aboriginal person who had been an advocate, had been helping to educate people, had been even overseas to talk about the richness of Aboriginal culture.
And so I saw some of the tragic circumstances that our First Nations people endured, and that certainly had a huge effect on me.
25 years before the death of Mr Ward, John Quigley was a police union lawyer who had defended officers implicated in other Aboriginal deaths in custody, including John Pat.
As a barrister, I accepted the brief for the police union on many occasions, but that was a job. I think politics, however, is a vocation where you're given the opportunity not only to represent people, but to try and improve the circumstances under which we all live. I felt moved to enter public life and try and move the dial a bit towards more justice.
At the time of Mr Ward's death, the former lawyer was now the Shadow Attorney General, who demanded justice.
The officers were up front listening to music, drinking cool water, whilst Mr Ward was expiring in an oven. I think I described it at the time as a coffin on wheels. There was no air conditioning, the temperatures reached searing heat. They didn't bother to stop and check on him. It was just dreadful.
And he actually died in this completely horrific manner in the back of that van on this trip. He, I don't want to say this, but he burnt to death. And there were, marks all over his body showing that. He was just treated as if he was not even an animal. We do read occasionally that the RSPCA and animal cruelty cases result in criminal convictions, and we saw nothing for Mr Ward.
The family of Mr Ward travelled almost 12 hours for the coronial inquest into his death, where the two guards who drove the elder were criticised for their lack of care.
The Director of Public Prosecution says there wasn't enough evidence anyone was criminally negligent. The guards completed a checklist of the vehicle before leaving for Kalgoorlie. The air conditioning was tested by a technician 3 weeks before the fateful journey, and it worked without complaint 2 days before.
The horrific death of Mr. Ward caused an outpouring of grief. The circumstances were incomprehensible.
There's a lot of people who could relate to Mr. Ward's circumstance. If you get picked up for a traffic offence, how could you end up being cooked in the back of a prison van on a 5-hour journey? It just wouldn't happen in the metropolitan area, would it? This is a traffic offender, for heaven's sake, that so many in the community have committed at some time in their life, a traffic offence. Now, I ask myself, would a person who was arrested for driving over the road down at Cottesloe Beach in the western suburbs on a drunken driving charge be held overnight in custody? I say no, they wouldn't have been. The next morning, the police then brought in a justice of the peace, a local person, a justice of the peace with no legal training, to consider what should happen to him, remanded him to Kalgoorlie. So that's like remanding someone arrested in Margaret River to Perth for their next appearance in the back of a van. This would not have happened.
Richard Harding is the state's Inspector of Custodial Services. He's revealed he repeatedly warned the government that if it didn't upgrade its fleet, a tragedy like this could occur.
Again, no one held accountable in terms of their behaviour for that high level of neglect.
They can't believe that no one will be charged over the death of the Aboriginal elder.
2 people should get punishment long time ago.
Some of the failures in Mr. Ward's case came down to the recommendations from the Royal Commission, which were not implemented until after his death.
A couple of the important reforms that would have saved Mr. Ward's life is, firstly, there would have been a custody notification service so that the police would have had to have rung the Aboriginal Legal Service hotline and said they've arrested Mr. Ward on a DUI charge. Bail would have been discussed at that point with the officer at the ALS. There was no reason why he shouldn't have been given bail.
There were good arguments for and against. Mr. Ward had breached bail on previous occasions, but then again, he had strong community connections.
We changed the law so that justices of the peace could not adjudicate bail proceedings.
I think it was so clear-cut that he was treated in such a highly inappropriate, wrong manner, and to die a very cruel death that we can't imagine, and a man who was highly regarded in his community. And yet, you know, racism killed him.
6 years after the Mr. Ward case, WA would be rocked again by another black death in custody in a region already tarnished by the John Pat case. This time, the small mining town of South Headland would be put firmly in the spotlight.
It's inhumane to detain someone in any watch house because they haven't paid a fine and leave them there for up to 4 days.
She was sick, but officers didn't believe her. In the throes of advanced septic shock, she died in custody.
They're walking around with a big hole in our hearts.